Welcome back to the memory lane, the place where we dust off the old albums and revisit the beautiful, quiet moments of life. Today, we have a very special story for you. It's about simpler times, the art of saving, and the kind of deep, unspoken love that we carry in our hearts forever. Get comfortable, grab a cup of tea, and let's take a little stroll down memory lane. In the quiet, slow-paced afternoons of my childhood, the most magical place in the world wasn't the toy store or the candy shop on the corner of Main Street. It was my grandmother's sewing corner. Grandma Helen was a woman of the Great Depression. She belonged to a generation that knew the true weight of a dollar, the sting of scarcity, and the profound art of making something out of nothing. She never threw anything away, and she never wasted a single scrap of fabric, a piece of string, or a drop of milk. At the center of her sewing corner, sitting proudly on a scarred oak side table, was a large, round Royal Dansk butter cookie tin. You know the ones, the heavy, blue Danish tins with the image of a windmill stamped on the lid. To an outsider, or a hungry child hoping for a sweet treat, the tin promised buttery, sugar-crusted cookies that melted in your mouth. But every child in our family knew the truth. There were no cookies inside that tin. Whenever I was lucky enough to spend a weekend at her cozy farmhouse, I would eagerly run to her side, tugging at her apron strings. "Grandma," I would plead, my eyes wide with excitement. "Can we open the cookie tin?" Grandma Helen would always pause her work, her spectacles sliding down the bridge of her nose as she offered me a warm, crinkling smile. "Of course, little one," she would say in her gentle, weathered voice. "But you know what's inside, don't you? Buttons." I would cheer, clapping my hands together. She would lift the heavy lid with a satisfying metal-on-metal hiss. Inside was not a crumb of shortbread, but a magnificent, colorful treasure trove of hundreds of buttons. Every shape, every size, every material imaginable was swimming together in that tin. There were smooth mother-of-pearl buttons that shimmered like captured moonlight, heavy brass anchor buttons from my grandfather's old naval peacoat, tiny, fragile plastic buttons from baby dresses long outgrown, and jagged wooden buttons that had survived decades of washing. For hours, I would sit on the worn floral rug, pouring the buttons out onto the carpet. I would arrange them by color, stack them like miniature towers, or run my small fingers through them, listening to the soothing, rhythmic clinking sound. It was the music of my grandmother's life. As I grew older and spent more time sitting quietly beside her, I began to understand that the cookie tin wasn't just a toy for a bored grandchild. It was a living archive of our family's history and a testament to a lifetime of quiet frugality. Grandma Helen taught me that to save a button was to save a piece of the garment, and to save the garment was to respect the hands that made it and the money used to buy it. "Every button has a story, my dear," she would tell me as her sewing machine hummed a steady rhythm. "Waste not, want not." That's how we survived the hard years. She would pick up a simple, chipped black button. "This one came off your grandfather's work shirt." It was the only one we had to replace when he lost the original in the fields during the autumn harvest of '42. We sewed it back on with dental floss because we couldn't afford a spool of thread that month. I would listen, fascinated by these small relics. In the modern world, when a button fell off a shirt, the shirt was often tossed into the trash and the whole shirt was replaced. But not in Grandma's house. In her world, things were repaired. Broken chairs were glued, torn stockings were mended, and leftover food was transformed into magnificent soups. This frugality wasn't born out of misery, it was born out of a deep reverence for what they had. Grandma Helen showed me that true wealth wasn't about how much you could buy, but how much you could appreciate and preserve. The empty cookie tin full of buttons was her kingdom of possibilities. Whenever a coat needed a fastener, or a sweater needed a mend, we would go to the tin, sift through the treasures, and almost always find the perfect match. But the most beautiful story connected to the cookie tin wasn't about mending clothes. It was a secret I only uncovered when I was a young woman, preparing to leave for college. Grandpa Thomas had passed away a few years prior, leaving a noticeable silence in the farmhouse. He was a good man, a man of few words but steady, hard-working hands. I had always known they loved each other, but theirs was a pragmatic love measured in shared morning coffees, quiet evenings listening to the evening news, and years of raising a family together. One afternoon, I sat with Grandma Helen in her bedroom. She was sorting through the cookie tin, looking for a specific pearlescent button to replace one that had fallen off her favorite Sunday cardigan. She reached deep into the bottom of the tin, moving aside a mountain of brown and blue buttons. From the very bottom, she pulled out something small wrapped in an old piece of yellowed tissue paper. She gently unwrapped it, revealing a beautiful, intricate, yet slightly faded blue silk rosebud. It wasn't a button. I looked at it, confused. "Grandma, what's this?" A soft, melancholic look washed over her face, and for a moment, she looked far away, perhaps traveling decades back in time. "When your grandfather and I were young," she began, her voice a tender whisper. "Before the war, money was terribly tight. We were saving every single penny to buy our first dairy cow. A cow meant milk, and milk meant we could feed our children. There were no luxuries." She stroked the faded silk petals. "In those days, I used to love sewing. I would walk past the Mercantile on 5th Street and see this beautiful, vibrant silk ribbon in the display window. It cost 75 cents, a fortune back then. I would stop and look at it every time I walked by, just dreaming of what a lovely dress I could make with it. I never told Thomas, of course. We needed that money for the farm." I leaned in closer, captivated by the story. "Well," Grandma Helen continued, a tear welling in the corner of her eye. "On our 5th anniversary, Thomas handed me a small, wrapped box. I opened it, and there was this exact ribbon. He had worked extra hours doing odd jobs at the neighboring sawmill, chopping wood in the freezing cold, just to buy me that silk. It was impractical. It was a foolish thing to spend money on when we needed flour and feed." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I was so angry with him for spending the money, but my heart was so full of love I thought it would burst. We couldn't afford to buy me a fancy dress to wear it, so I kept it safely tucked away." Years later, when our youngest was getting married, she said, her eyes glistening, "I needed something blue for her bridal bouquet. I took my old silk ribbon from our anniversary, and I crafted this rosebud to tie around her stems. It has been our family's something blue ever since. And when it's not being used, it rests here, at the bottom of the button box, right where my heart can always find it." I sat in absolute awe. Throughout my entire life, I had seen my grandparents as two ordinary, practical people. I had never imagined them as a young couple, stealing glances across a mercantile, making sacrifices out of pure, romantic devotion. Grandma Helen closed her eyes for a brief second, holding the silk rosebud close to her chest. Then, she carefully placed it back at the bottom of the tin, covered it with a blanket of buttons, and placed the lid back on. The years went by, and eventually, the farmhouse had to be sold as Grandma Helen moved into an assisted living facility. Helping her pack was an emotional journey. We went through decades of memories, boxing up old kitchenware, photo albums, and quilts. When we got to the sewing corner, I picked up the Royal Dansk butter cookie tin. It was heavier than I remembered, filled to the brim with decades of life, history, and quiet love. "Grandma," I said, holding the tin up, "what are we going to do with all these buttons?" She smiled her beautiful, knowing smile. "We're keeping them, of course," she said. "I may not sew as much anymore, but those buttons belong to our family. You never know when you'll need one." Today, that butter cookie tin sits on a shelf in my own home. I don't use it for sewing very often, but whenever the world gets too loud or modern life feels too fast, I take the tin down. I sit on my sofa, slowly lift the heavy lid, and pour the buttons onto the coffee table. Just as I did when I was a little girl, I run my fingers through the sea of buttons. I hear their gentle, rhythmic clinking. With every button, I remember the stories Grandma told me. I think of the Great Depression, the Navy coats, the dental floss, and the freezing cold sawmill where my grandfather worked to buy a scrap of silk ribbon. The tin is a reminder that the most valuable things in life aren't always grand or expensive. Sometimes, the deepest love is quiet, stitched into the hem of a child's winter coat or tucked away at the bottom of a button box. Grandma Helen taught me that everything holds a purpose if you just take the time to care for it. She taught me to save the scraps, mend the tears, and cherish the memories. And most importantly, she taught me that the truest form of love is the quiet, everyday devotion that lasts a lifetime. Thank you so much for joining us on the memory lane today. We hope this story brought a little warmth to your heart and reminded you of the beautiful, simple treasures in your own life. Sometimes, the smallest things like an old button or a faded ribbon hold the biggest memories of all. If this story touched your heart, please be sure to like this video, leave a comment below sharing your own family memories, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a trip down memory lane. Until next time, take care, keep your loved ones close, and always remember the beautiful stories written in your heart. Good night, everyone.